A fateful return. The early morning air was thick with the scent of dew as Marcus Johnson stood on the porch of his modest suburban home, the sun casting golden streaks across the horizon. His old Jeep, battered but reliable, waited in the driveway, its worn tires slightly deflated from years of use. The vehicle, much like Marcus himself, bore the scars of resilience. Today, however, it wasn't just another vehicle. It was the symbol of a journey, a return to a world Marcus thought he had left behind forever. The call to action. For 5 years, Marcus had lived a quieter life. After resigning from the force, he'd settled into a stable job as a logistics manager at a small company. The stress of his previous life had faded into a distant hum, replaced by evenings spent with his wife, Angela, and their teenage son, Ethan. But the call 2 days ago had shattered that peace, rekindling emotions he thought had dulled with time. It was the mayor herself who had contacted Marcus. Her tone was direct, her words carefully chosen. "Marcus," she'd said, "we need you. The department is fractured. Public trust is gone. We've had 3 chiefs in as many years, and morale is at an all-time low. The community demands change, and quite frankly, so do I." Your name came up repeatedly. "You're our best shot." Marcus had been stunned. Him. After all these years, he'd almost said no. But something inside him stirred, a flame that had never fully extinguished. He thought of his sister, Lisa, whose promising career had been snuffed out by systemic racism within the department. He thought of the countless victims of abuse he'd seen over his career, their stories drowned in bureaucracy and cover-ups. He thought of his younger self, idealistic and determined to make a difference. Angela's voice had brought him back to the present. "You've always said you wanted to fix what was broken. Maybe this is your chance." And so, here he was, preparing to step into a role that was as much a battlefield as it was a position of leadership. As he locked the front door, Angela appeared behind him, handing him a thermos of coffee. "You've got this," she said, her eyes full of quiet confidence. Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. The Jeep that could. The Jeep roared to life with a metallic groan, its engine coughing before settling into a steady hum. Marcus had bought the vehicle decades ago, just after his first promotion to detective. It had seen him through stakeouts, family road trips, and now, this monumental return. As he navigated the quiet streets of his neighborhood, memories of his years on the force flooded back. He had joined the police with a sense of purpose, believing in the power of justice and integrity. But over time, he had watched that idealism erode. Corruption had been rampant. Officers like him, who refused to play along, were marginalized, while others who abused their power rose through the ranks. The tipping point had been Lisa's ordeal. She had been an exceptional officer, her record spotless. Yet she had been passed over for promotions, mocked by colleagues, and isolated for speaking up against misconduct. Marcus had tried to shield her, but his efforts were met with indifference and hostility from leadership. The day she handed in her resignation, broken and defeated, Marcus had done the same. The Jeep rumbled onto the highway, and Marcus tightened his grip on the wheel. He wouldn't fail again. A new enemy emerges. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the city, officers Mike Roberts and Jack Miller were embarking on their morning patrol. The two had carved out a reputation as bullies, wielding their badges as weapons rather than symbols of protection. Mike, in his mid-40s, was a 10-year veteran who had long abandoned any pretense of serving the public. Jack, in his late 20s, idolized Mike, eager to emulate his arrogance and bravado. The duo was notorious among the community for their aggressive tactics. Complaints against them were numerous, but nothing ever stuck. Their superiors either looked the other way or actively shielded them. The streets they patrolled had become their playground, and their victims their sport. That morning, the streets were unusually quiet, much to their frustration. Jack tapped the dashboard of their cruiser impatiently. "Another boring shift in the dead zone," he muttered, referring to the affluent suburb that rarely reported crimes. Mike smirked, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. You don't wait for excitement, rookie. You create it. As if on cue, an old Jeep appeared in the distance. Its faded paint and dented body caught Mike's attention immediately. Well, look at that, he said, his grin widening. Looks like we found our morning entertainment. Jack leaned forward, squinting at the vehicle. Doesn't belong around here, he said, his voice tinged with disdain. What do you think? Drug runner? Thief? Only one way to find out, Mike replied, flipping on the patrol lights. With a sharp turn of the wheel, he veered the cruiser into the Jeep's path, forcing it to a sudden stop. The confrontation. Marcus's Jeep skidded to a halt, its tires screeching against the pavement. The abruptness of the maneuver sent his coffee thermos tumbling to the floor. He exhaled deeply, his instincts kicking in. This wasn't a routine stop, it was an ambush. Stepping out of the Jeep, Marcus straightened his posture, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing within. He had encountered officers like these before. Their swagger, their condescending smirks, their calculated aggression. It was all too familiar. Mike approached first, his hand resting casually on his holster. Morning, he said, his tone dripping with mock politeness. What brings you to this part of town? Don't see many vehicles like this around here. Jack circled to the passenger side, his smirk growing as he inspected the Jeep. Yeah, this thing looks like it barely runs. Got your papers, old man? Marcus met their eyes, his gaze unwavering. Is there a reason you've stopped me, officers? He asked evenly. Mike's grin faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. You look suspicious, he said. Driving this well-loved piece of machinery in a quiet neighborhood, just doing our job. Marcus chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to unnerve them. Suspicious, huh? And what exactly do you suspect me of? Step aside, Jack interjected, his voice rising. We're conducting a search. You need probable cause for that, Marcus replied calmly. And as far as I can tell, you don't have any. Mike's hand tightened on his holster, his frustration mounting. You're awfully confident for someone in your position. Marcus took a step forward, his calm exterior now tinged with authority. And you're awfully reckless for someone in yours. The revelation. Before either officer could respond, Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his badge. He held it up for them to see, the gleaming insignia unmistakable. Chief Marcus Johnson, he said, his voice firm. Effective today, I'm your new boss. The color drained from Mike's face, his smug expression replaced by a mixture of shock and dread. Jack's mouth opened, but no words came out. They stared at Marcus, their bravado evaporating in the face of the truth. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes locked on theirs. This is exactly why I'm here, he said. To root out the arrogance, the corruption, and the abuse of power that you've so comfortably indulged in. Consider this your first and final warning. He paused, letting his words sink in. Now get back in your car and do your job the right way. Mike and Jack hesitated for a moment before retreating to their cruiser, their confidence shattered. As they drove away, Marcus climbed back into his Jeep, his mind already racing with the challenges ahead. This was just the beginning. The fight for justice had started, and Marcus was ready to see it through. A system of shadows. The sun climbed higher into the sky as Marcus Johnson walked into the precinct for the first time as chief of police. The building, with its weathered bricks and outdated signage, seemed frozen in time. Its facade gave the impression of stability, but Marcus knew the real battles would unfold behind its closed doors. Inside, the air was thick with tension, and the echo of distant conversations filled the hallways. This was no ordinary workplace. It was a battlefield of egos, politics, and decades of entrenched behavior. As Marcus entered the lobby, all eyes turned toward him. The officers, clerks, and staff who had gathered for their morning routines stiffened at the sight of their new boss. Whispers rippled through the room like an undercurrent, some curious, others skeptical. "Is that him?" One voice muttered. "Thought he left the force years ago." Another said, louder this time. Marcus maintained a steady, composed stride, meeting the stares without flinching. He had anticipated this reaction. Change was a threat to the complacent, and his return heralded more than just a new face in the office. It was a challenge to the status quo. The inner circle. The conference room was a stark contrast to the chaos of the lobby. Its walls were lined with bulletin boards cluttered with case files, incident maps, and outdated motivational posters. A long table dominated the center, where Marcus's senior officers were seated. Each one had their own reputation, their own stake in the department's operations. Marcus scanned the room, taking note of the dynamics at play. At the head of the table sat Deputy Chief Harold Briggs, a heavy-set man with graying hair and a permanent scowl. Briggs had been the acting chief after the previous leader's abrupt resignation. Known for his rigid adherence to traditional policing, he was a man who valued loyalty above all else. Loyalty to him. Next to Briggs was Captain Diane Morales, head of the Community Outreach Division. Unlike Briggs, Diane had a reputation for being approachable and fair, often acting as a bridge between the department and the public. Marcus had heard of her efforts to rebuild trust in the community, but he also knew her work was often undermined by others in the room. Sergeant Doug Hendricks sat slouched in his chair, his fingers tapping impatiently on the table. Hendricks was known for his aggressive tactics and for brushing off complaints as part of the job. His influence within the patrol units was undeniable, and his presence was a reminder of the systemic issues Marcus had vowed to address. "Chief Johnson," Briggs said as Marcus took his seat at the head of the table. "Welcome. We've heard a lot about you." Marcus didn't miss the emphasis on the word heard. Briggs's tone was polite, but the undercurrent of skepticism was impossible to ignore. The room fell silent as Marcus placed a folder on the table and met each officer's gaze in turn. "Thank you, Deputy Chief," Marcus replied evenly. "I know my appointment has raised some eyebrows. That's understandable. But let me make one thing clear. I'm here to do the job, and I expect all of you to do the same." Briggs leaned back, crossing his arms. "Of course, Chief. We're all committed to that." Marcus opened the folder, revealing a stack of reports. "Good. Then let's start with these," he said, sliding the papers across the table. "These are citizen complaints from the past 2 years. Excessive force, harassment, misconduct. Most of them were either dismissed or ignored. That changes today." The room grew tense. Hendricks scoffed, sitting up straighter. "With all due respect, Chief, most of those complaints are baseless. People don't understand the pressure we're under out there." Marcus held his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Pressure doesn't excuse abuse, Sergeant. It's our job to handle that pressure without violating the public's trust. Dismissing these complaints sends the wrong message to the community and to our officers." Diane Morales nodded in agreement, but Briggs's expression hardened. "Chief," Briggs interjected, "I understand the need for accountability, but we also need to maintain morale. If officers feel they're constantly under scrutiny, it could impact their performance." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Briggs. "Morale isn't built on cover-ups and complacency, Deputy Chief. It's built on integrity. And if we don't hold ourselves accountable, we have no right to ask the public to trust us." The room fell silent again, the weight of Marcus's words settling over the table. He knew he was walking a fine line, but he also knew this was the moment to set the tone for his leadership: resistance and defiance. As the meeting adjourned, Marcus lingered in the room, reviewing the reports. Diane approached him, her expression thoughtful. "You've got your work cut out for you," she said quietly. Marcus looked up, offering the small smile. "I didn't expect otherwise, but I appreciate your support." Diane nodded. "You'll find some allies here, but not many. Briggs has a lot of influence, and Hendricks, well, let's just say he doesn't take kindly to change." "I'm not here to make friends," Marcus replied. I'm here to make this department better. Diane hesitated before speaking again. Just be careful. Not everyone in this building wants to see you succeed. Marcus thanked her and watched as she left the room. Her warning lingered in his mind as he prepared for his next challenge. The street-level reality. Later that day, Marcus decided to join a patrol unit to get a first-hand look at the city's dynamics. He insisted on driving himself, much to the surprise of the officers assigned to accompany him. Among them was Officer Eric Chen, a quiet but diligent patrolman who had recently transferred to the precinct. Chen was young, idealistic, and eager to prove himself. As they cruised through the neighborhoods, Marcus noticed the stark contrasts between areas. Some streets were lined with well-maintained homes and manicured lawns, while others bore the scars of neglect. Boarded-up buildings, graffiti-covered walls, and residents who avoided eye contact with the passing cruiser. "It's different out here than it looks on paper," Marcus said, breaking the silence. Chen nodded. "It is, sir. Some of these communities have given up on us. They see the badge and think we're just here to harass them." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And are they wrong?" Chen hesitated before answering. "Not always. There are good officers, but there are also those who abuse the uniform." Marcus appreciated Chen's honesty. It was a small but hopeful sign that not everyone in the department had been consumed by the system's flaws. As they continued their patrol, Marcus's radio crackled to life. A call came in about a disturbance at a nearby park. Nothing major, but enough to warrant attention. Marcus steered the jeep in that direction, eager to see how his officers handled such situations. A test of leadership. At the park, a small crowd had gathered around a heated argument between two teenagers. A patrol car was already on the scene, and Marcus recognized one of the officers as Jack Miller, the same man who had stopped him earlier that morning. Jack's posture was aggressive, his hand resting on his baton as he barked orders at the teenagers. The situation was escalating quickly, and Marcus knew it wouldn't take much for things to spiral out of control. He stepped out of the jeep, his presence immediately commanding attention. Jack froze, his face pale as recognition dawned. "Chief Johnson," he stammered, his tone shifting from authority to nervousness. Marcus ignored the greeting and turned his attention to the teenagers. "What's going on here?" he asked calmly. One of the teens, a tall boy with a defiant expression, gestured angrily at the other. "He took my phone. I just want it back." The other boy, smaller and visibly shaken, held up his hands. "I didn't take anything." "He's lying." Marcus nodded, assessing the situation. He addressed Jack without looking at him. "Did you search them?" "No, sir," Jack admitted. "Then let's not jump to conclusions," Marcus said firmly. He turned back to the boys. "I need you both to stay calm. If there's a misunderstanding, we'll sort it out." Within minutes, Marcus diffused the situation. The phone was found, dropped in the grass, and the boys were sent on their way with a warning to stay out of trouble. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus turned to Jack. "This is how we handle situations from now on," he said. "We de-escalate. We listen. We don't assume guilt." Jack nodded, though his expression remained tense. Marcus knew it would take time to undo years of learned behavior, but he was determined to lead by example. A glimpse of the road ahead. As the day drew to a close, Marcus returned to his office, exhausted but resolute. The challenges were greater than he had imagined, but so was his determination. The system was broken, yes, but it wasn't beyond repair. He pulled out a blank notebook and began writing down his goals for the department. Transparency, accountability, community engagement. These weren't just buzzwords. They were the foundation of the change he wanted to build. Marcus closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with plans. The road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but he was ready to walk it. For Lisa, for the community, for everyone who had been failed by the system. This was just the beginning. Seeds of resistance. The next morning, Marcus Johnson arrived at the precinct early, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The air was heavy with tension. The officers had clearly felt the ripple effect of his actions the previous day. The confrontation at the park, his direct challenge to authority in the meeting, and the new directives he had laid out had unsettled many. Change was coming, and the weight of it pressed heavily on the department. As Marcus walked through the precinct, he caught snippets of conversations, low murmurs, side glances, and a palpable sense of resistance. Some nodded politely as he passed, others avoided eye contact entirely. He knew these weren't just small reactions to his leadership. They were the seeds of defiance from those unwilling to embrace reform. Briggs' quiet maneuvering. In his office, Marcus began reviewing the department's annual budget when a knock sounded at the door. It was Deputy Chief Harold Briggs, carrying a folder under his arm and wearing his usual guarded expression. Marcus motioned for him to enter. "Morning, Chief," Briggs said, setting the folder on the desk. "I thought it'd be a good idea to go over the chain of command. You'll want to familiarize yourself with the key players." Marcus leaned back, watching Briggs closely. The deputy's tone was professional, but there was an edge to it, an undercurrent of territoriality. "Appreciated," Marcus replied, opening the folder. Inside was a detailed chart of officers, their ranks, and their areas of responsibility. But alongside it was something else, a list of grievances against officers. Some were minor infractions, while others were serious allegations that had been quietly dismissed. Marcus's brow furrowed as he scanned the list. "Interesting reading material," Marcus said, looking up. "Why bring this to me now?" Briggs gave a tight-lipped smile. "I thought you should know what you're dealing with. Some of these officers, well, they're good at their jobs, but not exactly by the book." Marcus tapped the folder with his finger. "And by the book is exactly what we're going to be." Briggs's expression didn't change, but his tone grew cooler. "I understand your intentions, Chief, but there's a balance to maintain. Push too hard, and you might find yourself dealing with more problems than solutions." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Thanks for the advice, Deputy Chief. But I didn't come here to maintain the status quo. If these good officers can't adapt, they'll have to find another line of work." Briggs stiffened, his smile fading. "Understood, Chief. I'll leave you to it." As Briggs exited, Marcus sat back in his chair, his instincts telling him that the deputy was more than just a skeptic. He was likely an active opponent of the changes Marcus wanted to implement. Briggs's warning was clear. Any disruption of the old ways would be met with resistance, and Marcus would need to navigate carefully. The Whisper Network. Meanwhile, in the officers' lounge, Sergeant Doug Hendricks and Officer Mike Roberts leaned against the counter, their voices low but heated. Hendricks's face was set in a scowl, his fingers drumming against his coffee cup. Mike, still shaken from his encounter with Marcus at the park, was fuming. "He humiliated me," Mike hissed. "In front of a crowd. I was just doing my job." Hendricks snorted. "Doing your job? You let him walk all over you. That's the problem with these new bosses. They don't understand how things work out here." Mike bristled. "He's not just new. He's gunning for us. Did you see that list he handed out yesterday? He's digging into complaints that were buried years ago." Hendricks leaned in, his voice dropping further. "Listen, this isn't the first time we've had someone like him. They come in, make a lot of noise, and then burn out when they realize the system doesn't change." Mike looked uncertain. "What if he doesn't burn out?" Hendricks smirked. "Then we make sure he does." The room grew silent as a few other officers nodded in agreement. The Whisper Network within the precinct was alive and well, and Marcus's actions had only fueled its growth. While Marcus was busy trying to implement change, others were already plotting to undermine him. Bridging the divide. Unaware of the conspiracies brewing, Marcus spent his afternoon meeting with representatives from the community. One of his first priorities as chief was to rebuild trust with the neighborhoods most affected by police misconduct. Diane Morales had helped organize a small forum at a local community center, and Marcus arrived eager to listen. The room was modest, but packed with residents of all ages and backgrounds. Some faces were wary, others openly hostile. Marcus stood at the front, Diane by his side. As he introduced himself, "I'm Marcus Johnson, your new chief of police," he began. "I know trust has been broken, and I don't expect to earn it back overnight. But I'm here to listen and to work with you to make this department what it should be, a service to this community, not a burden." A man in the back crossed his arms. "We've heard that before," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "What makes you different?" Marcus met his gaze. "Because I've been where you are. I've seen the system fail good people. I've felt it in my own family, and I'm here to change it from the inside." The room was silent for a moment before a woman raised her hand. "What about the officers who've been harassing us for years? Are you going to hold them accountable?" "Yes," Marcus said firmly. "I've already started reviewing past complaints, and I'm implementing new policies to ensure transparency and accountability. But I need your help. If you see something, report it. I can't fix what I don't know." The woman nodded, and a few others murmured in agreement. While the meeting didn't resolve all the tension, Marcus left feeling cautiously optimistic. The community wasn't ready to fully trust him yet, but they were willing to give him a chance. The first strike. That night, as Marcus drove home in his Jeep, his thoughts lingered on the day's events. He felt the weight of every decision, every conversation, but his resolve was unshaken. He knew change would be slow, but he was in it for the long haul. However, his optimism was shattered when he arrived home to find his mailbox smashed, its contents scattered across the lawn. A crude note was taped to the door of his house. It read, "This isn't your city. Stay in your lane." Marcus stood frozen, the implications of the message sinking in. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a warning. Someone within the department, or perhaps beyond, was making it clear that his reforms weren't welcome. Angela appeared at the doorway, her face pale as she saw the note. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling. "What's going on?" Marcus took her hand, his own anger masked by a calm exterior. "It's nothing I can't handle," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Inside, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring at the note. The challenges he faced weren't just procedural, they were personal. The resistance within the department was more entrenched than he had anticipated, and now it was turning hostile. But instead of fear, Marcus felt his resolve deepen. He wasn't just fighting for his own principles, he was fighting for every person who had been failed by the system. This was no longer just about reform. It was a battle for the soul of the city, and Marcus was ready to fight. Shadows and allies. The early dawn light streamed through the kitchen window as Marcus sat at the table, the crumpled note from the previous night still lying in front of him. Angela poured him a fresh cup of coffee, her expression a mixture of concern and resolve. "You need to tell someone about this," she said, her voice steady but insistent. "It's not just a prank. They're threatening you, Marcus." Marcus took a sip of the coffee, his eyes focused on the note as if trying to decipher its deeper meaning. "I know," he said after a long pause, "but if I react publicly, it might embolden whoever's behind this. They want me rattled, distracted. I can't let that happen." Angela crossed her arms, her brow furrowed. "You're not invincible, Marcus. And this isn't just about you. It's about all of us. You've got Ethan to think about, too." Marcus looked up at her, guilt flickering across his face. "I'll handle it," he said, though the weight of his promise hung heavy in the room. He didn't have a concrete plan yet, but one thing was clear. He couldn't afford to let this threat go unanswered. A new alliance. Later that morning, Marcus called Diane Morales into his office. She arrived promptly, carrying her ever-present notebook and a determined look. Marcus gestured for her to sit, and she took the chair across from his desk. "Diane," Marcus began, "I need someone I can trust. Someone who understands the stakes here and isn't afraid to take on the harder parts of this job." Diane raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I assume this has to do with more than just policy changes." Marcus handed her the note. Diane read it quickly, her jaw tightening. "Who you think is behind this?" she asked, her tone serious. Marcus leaned back in his chair. It could be anyone, from someone in the department to someone in the community who doesn't want to see change. But my gut tells me this is internal. The timing, the tone, it feels calculated. Diane nodded slowly. "You're probably right. There are plenty of officers here who don't want things to change. And Briggs, well, let's just say he's not exactly subtle about his disdain for you." Marcus frowned. "Briggs isn't stupid. If he's involved, he'll have insulated himself. But I need to know who's working against me. And I need evidence." Diane set the note down. "I'll help," she said without hesitation. "But we need to be careful. If this gets out, it could divide the department even further." "I know," Marcus replied. "That's why I'm only telling you. For now." Diane offered a faint smile. "I appreciate the trust, Chief. Let's get to work." The unraveling of trust. While Diane began discreetly investigating the note, Marcus turned his attention to the department's culture. He knew that fixing the systemic issues would require more than just new policies. It would require a fundamental shift in mindset. To that end, he organized a mandatory meeting for all officers, focusing on accountability and ethics. The precinct's main hall was filled with uniformed officers, their expressions ranging from indifferent to openly hostile. Marcus stood at the front, his posture commanding but approachable. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "I know change isn't easy, and I know some of you are skeptical about my approach. But let me be clear, this isn't about me. This is about us. This is about rebuilding trust with the community we serve." A few officers exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. Marcus pressed on. "I've reviewed dozens of complaints over the past 2 weeks. Many of them were dismissed without proper investigation. That stops now. From this point forward, every complaint will be reviewed thoroughly. If you're doing your job right, you have nothing to worry about. But if you're abusing your power, there will be consequences." The room buzzed with murmurs, and Marcus could see the unease spreading. He knew this approach would draw criticism, but he also knew it was necessary. Sergeant Hendricks raised his hand, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Chief, with all due respect, don't you think this will discourage officers from doing their jobs? If we're constantly under a microscope, how are we supposed to focus on protecting the city?" Marcus met Hendricks's gaze, unflinching. Protecting the city doesn't mean intimidating its residents. It doesn't mean cutting corners or bending the rules. If you can't do your job without violating someone's rights, you're in the wrong profession. Hendricks smirked but said nothing further. The tension in the room was palpable, but Marcus stood firm. He knew this was just the beginning of the pushback. An unexpected ally. As the meeting concluded, most of the officers filed out silently, but one lingered. Officer Eric Chen, the young patrolman Marcus had worked with on his first day, approached him. "Chief," Eric said hesitantly, "can I have a word?" Marcus nodded, gesturing for him to walk with him back to his office. Once inside, Eric closed the door behind them. "I just wanted to say, I appreciate what you're trying to do," Eric began. "Not everyone here does, but some of us joined this department to actually make a difference, and we've been waiting for someone like you." Marcus smiled faintly. "I'm glad to hear that, Eric. It's going to take people like you to help turn this place around." Eric shifted uncomfortably. "There's something else. I overheard something in the locker room yesterday. Hendricks and Roberts were talking about you. They didn't say much, but it sounded like they're planning something. I thought you should know." Marcus's expression darkened. "Thank you, Eric. Keep your ears open, but don't put yourself in harm's way. If you hear anything concrete, come to me immediately." Eric nodded, his resolve evident. "Will do, Chief." As Eric left, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. Amidst the resistance, there were those who believed in his vision. They were the ones he would fight for. The trap is set. Later that evening, Diane returned to Marcus's office with new information. She had quietly reviewed security footage from the precinct's parking lot and found something unusual. A figure, wearing a hoodie and avoiding the cameras, had been seen near Marcus's Jeep on the night the note was left. "I couldn't get a clear shot of their face," Diane said, showing Marcus the grainy footage. "But the timing matches. Whoever this is, they're likely someone with access to the precinct." Marcus studied the footage carefully. "It's a start," he said. "But we need more." Diane hesitated before speaking again. "There's another option," she said. "We could set a trap. Draw them out." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" Diane leaned forward, her voice low. "We leak a bit of information. Something that makes it seem like you're onto them. If they're desperate enough, they might slip up." Marcus considered her suggestion carefully. It was risky, but it could work. "Do it," he said finally. "But make sure it doesn't put anyone else in danger." Diane nodded, a determined glint in her eye. "I'll handle it." The battle lines are drawn. As the precinct settled into an uneasy rhythm over the next few days, the tension between Marcus's supporters and his detractors grew more pronounced. Diane's plan was in motion, and whispers of a department-wide audit began to circulate. Meanwhile, Eric continued to keep an eye on Hendricks and Roberts, reporting anything suspicious. But Marcus knew the fight wasn't just about rooting out bad actors. It was about building something better in their place. And though the road ahead was fraught with danger, he was ready to face it head-on. The trap was set, and the first real confrontation was just around the corner. The sting. The precinct was quiet as Marcus Johnson arrived early the next morning. The stillness felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Over the past week, Diane Morales' plan had begun to take shape, and whispers of an internal audit were spreading like wildfire through the department. The mounting tension was almost tangible, but Marcus kept his composure. He knew they were closing in on the source of the note, and possibly more. As Marcus entered his office, Diane was already waiting for him, her laptop open and her expression serious. She had spent the night finalizing the plan, poring over surveillance footage, personnel files, and anonymous tips that had trickled in since their meeting. "They've taken the bait," she said without preamble, sliding a folder across the desk. "Hendricks and Roberts were overheard last night talking about how Johnson won't see it coming. They didn't go into detail, but it's clear they're planning something." Marcus opened the folder, his jaw tightening as he read the transcripts Diane had compiled. Hendricks was brazen, openly mocking Marcus and boasting about his untouchability. Roberts, though less vocal, was clearly complicit. Their words hinted at a larger scheme, but the specifics remained elusive. "We need to move carefully," Marcus said. "If we confront them too soon, they'll shut down, and we'll lose our chance to uncover the full extent of what's going on." Diane nodded. "I've got a team discreetly monitoring their activity. If they make a move, we'll know." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to act recklessly, but he also couldn't let this drag on indefinitely. The longer Hendricks and Roberts operated unchecked, the more damage they could do, not just to him, but to the department's fragile sense of stability. The breaking point. Later that afternoon, Marcus called a department-wide meeting in the main hall. The room was packed with officers, detectives, and administrative staff, all of them eyeing Marcus with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. At the front of the room, Hendricks leaned against the wall, his arms crossed and a smug grin on his face. Roberts stood beside him, fidgeting nervously. Marcus stepped up to the podium, his expression calm but commanding. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady. "As many of you know, I've initiated a review of past complaints and internal practices. This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about ensuring that we're upholding the values this department was built on." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Marcus caught Hendricks whispering something to Roberts, his smirk widening. Ignoring them, Marcus pressed on. "Accountability isn't just a word, it's a commitment. And it starts with us. Effective immediately, we'll be implementing new protocols for reporting and investigating misconduct. Every officer will be required to attend mandatory training sessions on de-escalation and community engagement. These changes won't be easy, but they're necessary. The room erupted into a mixture of applause and grumbling. Marcus let the noise settle before continuing. I understand that change can be uncomfortable. But if we want to rebuild trust with the community, it has to start here. As the meeting ended and the room began to empty, Marcus noticed Hendricks lingering near the back, his expression darker than before. Their eyes met briefly, and Marcus saw something in Hendricks's gaze that sent a chill down his spine. Defiance mixed with something more sinister. The sting operation. That evening, Diane and Eric Chen met with Marcus in his office to finalize their plan. Using the surveillance footage and intelligence they had gathered, they had devised a sting operation to catch Hendricks and Roberts in the act. We'll use the parking lot as the staging ground, Diane explained, pointing to a map of the precinct. Hendricks and Roberts are scheduled to patrol the east side of the city tomorrow night. We'll plant a decoy vehicle in their path, one that matches the description of a car involved in a fake investigation. If they take the bait, we'll have enough evidence to bring them in. Eric looked uneasy. What if they don't fall for it? Or worse, what if they figure out it's a setup? They won't, Diane said confidently. We've been careful. They think they're untouchable. That arrogance will be their downfall. Marcus nodded, his mind already calculating the risks. I'll be on site, he said. If anything goes wrong, I want to be there to handle it. Diane hesitated but didn't argue. She knew better than to try to dissuade Marcus when his mind was set. The setup. The next night, the plan was set into motion. The decoy vehicle, a nondescript sit-in, was parked in a quiet alley on the east side of the city, its location transmitted to Hendricks and Roberts under the guise of a tip from dispatch. Diane and Eric monitored the operation from a nearby van, their equipment capturing every move. Marcus, dressed in plainclothes, sat in an unmarked car parked a block away. His heart pounded as he watched the street through binoculars, waiting for the cruiser to arrive. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but finally, the headlights appeared. Hendricks and Roberts pulled up beside the decoy vehicle, their movements casual but deliberate. Hendricks stepped out first, his flashlight scanning the car's interior. Roberts followed, his posture tense as he glanced nervously around. They're in position, Diane's voice crackled over the radio. Marcus watched as Hendricks opened the car door and began rifling through the glove compartment. Roberts stood guard, his hand resting on his baton. It was clear they were looking for something. Drugs, money, anything they could claim as evidence to justify their stop. Got it, Hendricks muttered, holding up a small bag that Diane had planted earlier. Let's tag this and call it in. Another win for the good guys. Marcus's jaw tightened. This was more than just misconduct. It was outright fabrication. He stepped out of the car and approached the scene, his presence catching both men off guard. Evening, gentlemen, Marcus said, his tone deceptively calm. Hendricks froze, his flashlight beam flickering across Marcus's face. Chief Johnson, he said, recovering quickly, didn't expect to see you here. Marcus folded his arms, his gaze cold. I could say the same about you. Care to explain what you're doing? Hendricks hesitated, but his smirk returned. Just following up on a tip. Found this in the car. Looks like a major bust. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes locked on the bag in Hendricks's hand. That's interesting, considering this vehicle was planted here as part of an internal investigation. The color drained from Roberts's face, but Hendricks didn't flinch. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice steady. We were just doing our job. Marcus nodded to Diane, who stepped out of the van, holding a tablet displaying the live footage of the entire encounter. Your job, Marcus said. Because what I see here is two officers tampering with evidence and abusing their authority. Roberts stammered, but Hendricks's smirk finally faltered. This is a setup, he growled. "You can't do this." "I can, and I will," Marcus said firmly. "Turn in your badges. You're both suspended, effective immediately." The fallout. Back at the precinct, word of Hendricks and Roberts' suspension spread like wildfire. Some officers were stunned, others quietly celebrated, but the message was clear. Marcus Johnson wasn't backing down. As Marcus sat in his office that night, reviewing the footage once more, he felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The battle was far from over, but this was a victory, a small but significant step toward the change he had promised. Diane entered, a rare smile on her face. "We got them," she said simply. Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "One battle down. But the war is just beginning." The shadows within the department hadn't been fully exposed, but the light was starting to break through, and Marcus was ready to keep fighting. A reckoning. The precinct buzzed with tension the morning after the suspension of Sergeant Hendricks and Officer Roberts. The sting operation had shaken the department to its core, sending a clear message that Marcus Johnson was not a leader to be trifled with. Yet Marcus knew this victory was only the beginning. The deeper rot within the department had been exposed, and the fight to purge it would require more than just decisive action. It would demand unrelenting courage. Unmasking the network. As Marcus sat in his office, poring over new reports, Diane Morales entered with an urgent expression, a folder clutched in her hands. "Chief," she said, closing the door behind her, "we have a bigger problem than we thought." Marcus leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "What's happened?" Diane placed the folder on his desk. "I've been digging deeper into Hendricks' history, cross-referencing complaints, disciplinary records, and whistleblower accounts. It's worse than I imagined. Hendricks wasn't acting alone. There's a network of officers tied to him, officers who've been covering for each other for years." Marcus opened the folder and scanned its contents. The evidence was damning. A web of falsified reports, mishandled evidence, and patterns of abuse that stretched across multiple precincts. Names he hadn't suspected appeared alongside familiar ones, creating a picture of systemic corruption that was both sprawling and insidious. "They've built a fortress," Diane continued. "And it's not just the rank and file. Some of the higher-ups have been complicit, either by turning a blind eye or actively participating." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Briggs." Diane hesitated, then nodded. "His name shows up more than once. Nothing definitive, but enough to suggest he's been shielding people like Hendricks." Marcus exhaled sharply, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Briggs's hostility toward his reforms now made perfect sense. He wasn't just resistant to change. He was protecting himself. "We need to act fast," Marcus said, his voice resolute. "If we wait, they'll cover their tracks." Diane nodded. "I've already prepared a case to present to Internal Affairs. But if we go through official channels, it'll leak. Briggs has too many allies. We need a way to bypass the usual protocols." Marcus's mind raced. He knew Diane was right. The corruption ran so deep that even the process of holding people accountable was compromised. But there was one option, a risky, high-stakes move that could turn the tide. "I'll bring in the State Oversight Committee," Marcus said. "They've been looking for an opportunity to investigate systemic corruption. If we give them this, they'll take it." Diane's eyes widened. "That's going to rattle a lot of cages." "Good," Marcus replied. "It's time." The confrontation. Before moving forward with the Oversight Committee, Marcus knew he had to confront Briggs directly. The deputy chief had spent years operating in the shadows, but Marcus wasn't about to let him continue unchecked. Marcus called Briggs into his office later that afternoon. The deputy chief entered with his usual air of authority, but his guarded expression betrayed his unease. "You wanted to see me, Chief?" Briggs asked, taking a seat. Marcus didn't waste time. He slid the folder across the desk, watching as Briggs's eyes flicked over the documents. "I think you know why you're here." Briggs's face darkened, but he remained composed. "These are serious allegations," he said, his tone measured. But you have no proof tying me to any of this. Not yet, Marcus replied. But the evidence is mounting, and the connections are clear. You've been complicit in protecting officers like Hendricks, officers who've abused their power and tarnished the badge. Briggs leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Careful, Chief. You're making a lot of assumptions. And if you go down this road, you might find yourself alienating the very people you need to lead this department. Marcus's voice hardened. I don't need people like Hendricks and Roberts. And I certainly don't need leaders who enable them. The days of covering up misconduct are over, Briggs. You can either step aside, or you can be removed. Briggs's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. You're making enemies you can't afford, Johnson. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. And you're clinging to a system that's already crumbling. The choice is yours, Harold. Briggs stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This isn't over, he said before storming out. Marcus watched him go, his resolve stronger than ever. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. Bringing in the Oversight Committee. The next morning, Marcus met with representatives from the State Oversight Committee in a secure location outside the precinct. The committee, known for its rigorous investigations and independence, had been looking for an opportunity to address the city's policing issues for years. Marcus laid out the evidence, detailing the patterns of corruption and the network of complicit officers. The committee members listened intently, their expressions growing more serious as the scope of the problem became clear. This is a systemic failure, one of the representatives said. We'll need full access to personnel records, case files, and internal communications. You'll have it, Marcus replied. But you need to move quickly. Briggs and his allies will do everything they can to obstruct this. The committee agreed, and the wheels were set in motion. By the time Marcus returned to the precinct, the investigation was already underway. State agents began arriving in unmarked vehicles, their presence sending shockwaves through the department. The fallout begins. As the investigation unfolded, officers who had long operated with impunity found themselves under scrutiny. Hendricks and Roberts were just the beginning. The committee uncovered a trail of misconduct that implicated dozens of officers and even extended into city administration. Briggs, true to his word, didn't go quietly. He rallied his allies, attempting to discredit Marcus and paint the investigation as a political vendetta. But the evidence was overwhelming. And as more whistleblowers came forward, Briggs's position became untenable. The breaking point came when Diane, armed with damning evidence, testified before the committee about Briggs's role in obstructing justice. Her testimony, combined with the mounting pressure, forced Briggs to resign in disgrace. His departure sent a clear message. The old guard was falling. A new dawn. With Briggs out of the picture and the Oversight Committee's work yielding results, Marcus turned his focus to rebuilding the department. He implemented new policies emphasizing transparency, accountability, and community engagement. Officers like Eric Chen became key players in the reform efforts, serving as examples of what policing could and should be. The community, once skeptical, began to see the changes taking shape. Marcus held regular town hall meetings, inviting residents to voice their concerns and participate in shaping the department's future. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild. But Marcus knew the work was far from over. The scars of corruption ran deep, and the road to redemption would be long. Yet, as he stood in front of a crowd at a community event, surrounded by officers who shared his vision, he felt a sense of hope. Change doesn't happen overnight, Marcus said, addressing the crowd. But together, we can create a department that serves and protects with integrity. This is just the beginning. The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time in years, Marcus felt the weight of his mission lift slightly. He had faced the shadows and emerged stronger, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of what was possible. The battle was far from over, but Marcus Johnson was ready to face whatever came next, with courage, determination, and the unwavering belief that justice would prevail. The end.